We've all heard the cliché tale of the Titanic's doom, the iceberg, the sinking ship, the tragic loss of life. Yet, there's so much more to this nautical disaster than meets the eye. Join us on this voyage of discovery, from the heroic deeds of the engineers to the icy origins of the infamous iceberg. Get ready as we uncover 20 bone-chilling Titanic facts no one knew. Picture this, it's the year 1912, and the Titanic is sinking faster than the hopes of Rose getting away with Jack. But did you know that none of the engineers survived? Now, it isn't because they couldn't get onto the few lifeboats available. No, it's because they chose to stay loyal to their jobs. While passengers were busy grabbing their jewels and furs, these men were down in the engine room, keeping the ship afloat for as long as they could. Joseph Bell and his team of 24 engineers, 6 electrical engineers, 2 boilermakers, a plumber, and his clerk, are the unsung heroes of the Titanic. They knew that without power, the Titanic would be as useful as a screen door on a submarine. In fact, when the Titanic split into two, the engineers continued to perform their duty, keeping the power running until the very last moment. These brave souls sacrificed their lives to give others a fighting chance. They may not have received the recognition they deserved, but they'll forever be remembered as the ones who ensured the ship's distress signals could be sent before it hit the ocean floor. The iceberg that sent the Titanic to the bottom of the ocean wasn't just any ordinary chunk of ice. It was the product of some seriously steamy weather that occurred 4 years before the doomed voyage. A group of scientists at the University of Sheffield determined that the Titanic's iceberg nemesis was caused by a period of warm, wet weather that weakened glaciers and made them more likely to cave. The iceberg that finally did the deed was colossal, 400 feet in length and weighing a massive 2 megatons. That's about as heavy as a herd of 40 elephants or a small moon. The Titanic didn't stand a chance against this iceberg that had been brewing for years. The iceberg buckled over 100 meters of the ship's hull as if it were made of paper, and the rest is history. Who knew Mother Nature had such a twisted sense of humor? Atop the Titanic's mighty frame sat 4 towering smokestacks, or as they were called, funnels. You might assume that all 4 of these funnels were working their chimney magic, billowing smoke into the sky. But hold on to your life jackets, reality had a different plan. In a stroke of audacity, the crafty folks at the White Star Line decided that only 3 of the funnels would do any actual smoke-spewing work. Why, you ask? Back in the early 1900s, funnels were the embodiment of speed and safety, and the White Star Line, in its infinite wisdom, wanted the Titanic to look impressive, at least from the outside. So, they cunningly added a 4th funnel, a complete imposter, nothing more than a fancy facade. Inside this faux funnel was a luxurious first-class smoking room, fit for the finest cigar-puffing passengers. It was all smoke and mirrors, quite literally. And the deceit didn't stop there. The Titanic siblings, the Olympic and the Britannic, followed suit with their own faux funnels. Apparently, these mischievous ships believed that adding a non-functional, purely ornamental 4th funnel would dazzle sophisticated passengers. Who needs functionality when you can have aesthetic appeal? Over 2,200 souls set sail on the Titanic, blissfully unaware of the chilling fate lurking beneath the icy depths. Here's the kicker, the cursed ship only had a measly 20 lifeboats, instead of the 64 boats it originally needed. Can you believe it? That's like bringing a teaspoon to a flood. The Titanic's owners had peculiar priorities, deciding that a boatload of lifeboats would clutter the deck and spoil the swanky views for their precious first-class passengers. To make matters worse, outdated safety regulations designed for ships half the Titanic's size were still in place. They assumed that even a damaged ship could stay afloat for hours, giving the lifeboats plenty of time to make multiple trips and rescue everyone. But reality slapped them in the face. The Titanic sank in about 20 minutes. Years later, a document emerged revealing a safety inspector's desperate pleas for 10 more lifeboats. But the greedy owners, obsessed with leaving on time, dismissed him faster than a clam shutting its shell. If only they had listened, nearly 700 more people might have survived. The Titanic remains a chilling reminder of human arrogance, a cautionary tale etched in history's depths. The Titanic's sinking was a tragedy of epic proportions, with more than 1,500 lives lost. But the real tragedy is that we still don't know exactly how many people died. Official figures state 1,514, but some sources suggest it could be 1,419 or as high as 1,635. Let's talk about the recovery of the bodies. Recovering bodies from the sea is never a pleasant task, and those who did it for the Titanic can attest to that. They managed to recover between 316 and 337 bodies, take your pick. Only 23% of the dead were recovered, the rest remain lost to the depths. Well, they're still down there somewhere, but wait, it gets darker. To this day, there are still bodies that remain unidentified. In fact, 42 of the bodies buried in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, remain unidentified. How can you identify someone when they were traveling under a false name or when the lists of survivors were made amidst the chaos of the disaster? In 2008, for example, they finally identified the body of a 19-month-old baby, Sydney Leslie Goodwin. It only took 96 years, but hey, better late than never, right? What if we told you that the Titanic's demise wasn't just due to bad luck and poor navigation? The actual villain was an optical illusion. Yes, you heard that correctly. According to new research by historian Tim Maltin, atmospheric conditions that night were just right for superrefraction, a fancy term for the bending of light that causes mirages. Yep, you heard that right. The Titanic was done in by a mirage. Apparently, this phenomenon was recorded by several ships in the area, but no one realized the danger it posed. The Titanic's lookouts couldn't see the iceberg in time, and the nearby freighter, the Californian, didn't even know the Titanic was there. Why, you ask? Because the air was all wonky, with layers of cold air below layers of warmer air, creating a false horizon that made everything look closer than it really was. The Titanic fired off distress rockets, but they looked much lower than they actually were thanks to the mirage. And when the Californian saw the rockets, they figured it was just some ship sailing away and didn't even bother to come to the Titanic's rescue. The more we hear it, the more we believe that this ship was cursed inside and out. Did you know that lifeboat drills were a common practice among ocean liners in the early 1900s? Yep, even the crew of the Titanic were expected to undertake these drills on a weekly basis. But you know what's crazy? On the day the Titanic hit an iceberg, the lifeboat drill was cancelled. And who made the call to cancel it? None other than Captain Edward John Smith himself. It's still a mystery why he decided to scrap the drill, but some say it's because he wanted to hold one last Sunday service before retirement. How noble of him. But hold on, there were reports of ice in the area, and other ships had even passed on warnings. So why on earth would the captain cancel the one thing that could prepare the crew and passengers for an emergency situation? It's like skipping the safety demonstration on a plane because, let's be real, when do you ever need to use it? Well, unfortunately for the Titanic crew and passengers, their luck ran out that night. The Titanic struck an iceberg on April 14, and it sank, taking the lives of over 1,500 people. Maybe if the lifeboat drill had taken place, some of those lives could have been saved. You see, according to popular belief, the courageous band aboard the ill-fated ship played on until the bitter end, providing a small glimmer of musical comfort to the terrified passengers. James Cameron's iconic film Titanic depicted this heartbreaking scene featuring the hymn Nearer, My God, to Thee. A Night to Remember, the 1958 film, also portrayed a similar moment. But in reality, the band consisted of 8 musicians, not a quaint string quartet like the movies would have you believe. Led by Wallace Henry Hartley, they entertained the esteemed passengers in the first-class saloon and the ship's restaurant. Now, as for the music they played during the ship's final moments, the accounts differ. Contrary to popular belief, survivor Harold Bride, the wireless operator, testified that the last tune he heard was Autumn. But let's not get too carried away with the tunes. The band, it seems, had the foresight to pack away their instruments before succumbing to the icy depths. Only 3 out of the 8 musicians' bodies were recovered, and in a dark twist, Wallace Hartley himself was found nearly 2 weeks later clutching his case with his beloved violin inside. One could argue that his treasured instrument played a role in keeping his lifeless body afloat. How ironic, isn't it? Imagine the day, it's April 15, 1912, and the SS Californian is cruising through the icy waters of the North Atlantic. The crew is minding their own business when suddenly they spot the Titanic's lights on the horizon. The Californian crew notices the distress rockets and reports it to Captain Lord, who is sound asleep in his cozy bed. Lord suggests they use Morse code to contact the Titanic instead of waking up the wireless operator. And when the officers on the Californian saw more rockets, did Captain Lord finally do something? Again, nope. He just brushed it off, thinking they were just some company signals. But the real kicker is when the Carpathia arrived to rescue the survivors, and the Californian finally got off its lazy butt to go check out the scene. What did they find? Wreckage, and that's it. And the icing on the cake? Captain Lord's conflicting and incomplete testimony. He couldn't even get his story straight about whether he saw the rockets or not. Lord claimed his ship was 30 miles from the Titanic, but other crew members claimed it was less than 20. And what happened to the ship's logs? Oh, they just conveniently disappeared. In the end, both inquiries found Captain Lord and the Californian crew at fault. If only they had listened to the distress signals, they could have saved more lives, maybe even all of them. But hey, who needs to be a hero when you can just go back to bed, right? It was a tragedy that could have been avoided. Among the wreckage deep beneath the ocean surface, a haunting discovery was made, a single item that could have changed everything. In the years following this infamous disaster, a haunting question plagued the minds of many: could those binoculars have averted the tragedy? If only a crew member in the crow's nest had laid eyes upon the iceberg in time, perhaps the ship could have steered clear, sparing countless lives. Here's where the plot thickens: those very binoculars were indeed aboard the Titanic, but no one knew of their existence. Why, you ask? It seems a certain sailor by the name of David Blair, who was meant to be on the voyage but was reassigned, forgot to leave behind the key to the locker. One survivor, Fred Fleet, boldly claimed that if those binoculars had been available, they would have spotted the iceberg in the nick of time. He swore they could have maneuvered the ship out of harm's way. However, some skeptics argue that it was simply too dark out there, with no moonlight to guide their path and an eerily calm sea devoid of ripples to reveal the lurking danger of icebergs. On board was Violet Jessup, famously nicknamed Miss Unsinkable. Her incredible survival story makes one forget about Jack and the Door. Jessup, a stewardess for the White Star Line, first experienced disaster in 1911 aboard the RMS Olympic when it collided with the HMS Hawke. Despite severe damage, Jessup and the crew managed to get the ship back to port, saving everyone on board. The following year, she was aboard the Titanic when it famously sank on its maiden voyage. As the ship went down, Jessup was ordered onto a lifeboat and was handed a baby to look after. Imagine being on a sinking ship, tasked with protecting a baby while trying to save your own life, but Jessup succeeded admirably. Her adventures didn't end there. In 1916, she was aboard the HMHS Britannic when it hit a mine and sank. Though she escaped, she sustained a fractured skull. Undeterred, Jessup continued her career on ships, even serving as a nurse during World War I. The Titanic was lauded as a marvel of modern engineering, yet it had more than one fatal flaw. Why did the unsinkable Titanic sink? Praised for its double bottoms and 15 watertight bulkheads, the ship was deemed nearly indestructible. However, the walls separating these bulkheads were shorter than expected, allowing water to flow freely between compartments. Even more astonishingly, the tops of the supposedly watertight bulkheads were left unsealed, rendering them ineffective. Adding to the disaster, the crew received multiple iceberg warnings but didn't act on them. Radio operator Jack Phillips, overwhelmed with passenger messages, ignored a critical alert from the SS Californian. The message lacked a code to grab Captain Smith's attention, and Phillips, frustrated, told the Californian's operator to shut up. Shortly after, the Californian's operator went to bed, and the Titanic collided with the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., just an hour after the radio was shut down. In 2004, a photograph emerged that showed more than just ordinary debris. It revealed a boot and a leather coat, hinting at the possible presence of human remains. Renowned filmmaker James Cameron, who has visited the Titanic wreck 33 times, claims he has never seen any human remains. Yet, with a catastrophic event claiming approximately 1,500 lives, it's hard to dismiss the possibility that human remains might still rest within the unexplored chambers of the ship. Federal officials argue over preserving the wreck, which has been under protection since its discovery in 1985 and the enactment of the RMS Titanic Memorial Act in 1986. While only around 340 bodies were recovered, the fate of the missing souls remains one of the Titanic's most somber mysteries. John Jacob Astor, the world's richest man at the time, was also aboard the Titanic. More than just the wealthiest passenger, Astor was a man of many talents and interests. Known for his innovative mind and appreciation for the finer things, he had spent years traveling abroad before returning to manage his family fortune, valued at $150 million at the time. Astor also dabbled in writing, penning a semi-scientific novel, A Journey in Other Worlds, and invented mechanical devices, including a bicycle brake and a pneumatic road improver. Astor's business acumen extended to hospitality, as he was responsible for building the Astoria Hotel. Despite his vast wealth and ingenuity, even he could not escape the tragic fate that befell the Titanic. In New York City in 1897, the hotel was adjacent to the Waldorf Hotel, which had been built by his cousin William Waldorf Astor. Together, they formed the Waldorf Astoria, one of the most luxurious hotels in the world. But Astor's personal life was not without its scandals. He divorced his first wife, Ava Shippen, in 1909 and married 18-year-old Madeline Force in 1911. They embarked on a trip to Egypt and Paris before deciding to return to America as first-class passengers aboard the Titanic. Tragically, John Jacob Astor did not survive the sinking of the Titanic. His body was recovered from the sea on April 22, 1912, and he was buried in Trinity Cemetery in New York. Before the voyage, 6 people had already died, and we all know about the tragic loss of life on the ship itself. However, even before it set sail, the Titanic claimed the lives of 8 workers and caused a whopping 28 severe accidents during its construction. If you thought that number was high, consider this: they were actually expecting even more deaths given the time period. The Titanic cost a hefty £1.2 million to build, and it was standard to anticipate 1 death for every £100,000 spent. They had estimated around 15 deaths. How messed up is that? Most of the 8 people who died during construction fell from the ship or its staging, but the story of James Dobbin is especially chilling. He was a shipwright who was crushed to death on the day the Titanic was launched, in front of 10,000 people no less. As the ship was sliding into the river lagoon, poor James was losing his life. Out of all the men who died during construction, only 5 of their names are known: Samuel Scott, William Clark, John Kelly, Robert Murphy, and James Dobbin. In 2012, a plaque was unveiled in Belfast to memorialize all 8 workers who lost their lives building the ship. It's time for today's subscriber pick. One of our subscribers shared an image that left him and his friends perplexed. They were checking out different pictures of the Titanic wreckage when they stumbled upon a puzzling image overlooked by others. It appears to show a man under the sea, alive, exploring the sunken ship. What they discovered shocked the world. Can you help us solve this mystery? Who is this man? Is it the ghost of someone who did not survive? Remember to comment below and let us know your thoughts. Now, on to the next topic. Once upon a time, a Japanese civil servant named Hosono was sent on a research mission to Russia by the Japanese Ministry of Transport. On his way back, he boarded the infamous Titanic as a second-class passenger. During that fateful night, he was awakened by a steward and tried to reach the deck, but a crew member, assuming he was a third-class passenger, stopped him. As he watched Lifeboat 10 being loaded, an officer shouted, "Room for 2 more," and a man jumped aboard. Hosono decided to follow suit. Little did he know this would mark the beginning of his downfall. At first, his story didn't attract much attention. He went to his friends at Mitsui in New York to ask for help returning home. But when a local newspaper dubbed him the lucky Japanese boy, a media frenzy began. The seaman in charge of the boat, Edward Bewley, told a U.S. Senate inquiry that Hosono and another man must have disguised themselves as women to sneak aboard. The Japanese press labeled him a coward, and he was ostracized by society. He lost his job and was even criticized in school textbooks as an example of dishonor. However, he was too valuable to lose, so the ministry re-employed him, and he continued working until 1939. Can you believe it? The moon might have been the culprit behind the Titanic sinking. Scientists now claim that a supermoon caused a massive iceberg to drift into the Titanic's path, leading to the tragic end of the unsinkable ship. Apparently, this supermoon caused an unusually high tide that pulled the iceberg away from Greenland and into the shipping lanes traveled by the Titanic. According to forensic astronomers at Texas State University, this type of iceberg would normally have melted before reaching the Titanic's path, but the supermoon's tide was so strong that it prevented it from melting. It is believed that this alignment between the moon and Earth occurred on January 4, 1912, and the Titanic sank just a few months later, on April 15 of the same year. What's even more shocking is that this theory could explain why the experienced Titanic captain, Edward Smith, seemed to ignore warnings of icebergs in the area. He likely never expected an iceberg of such enormous size to drift so far south, all thanks to the moon. The Titanic faces a fate even more dramatic than its ill-fated sinking. Back in 1985, oceanographer Robert Ballard discovered the rusting hulk of the Titanic, hidden deep beneath the Atlantic's surface. The ship seemed frozen in time, preserved by the harsh conditions at over 3.12 kilometers below sea level. However, between treacherous deep-sea currents, pesky metal-eating bacteria, and good old-fashioned salt corrosion, the Titanic is deteriorating faster than a melting ice cube in the Sahara. By 2030, we'll be left with nothing more than a big pile of rust. Blame it on Honus Titanica, the microscopic culprits responsible for feasting on iron and sulfur. They've turned the ship into a grotesque masterpiece of stalactite-like formations resembling rusty icicles. The ship is already collapsing upon itself, like Captain Edward Smith's quarters. Remember that bathtub you used to see in photos? It's now faded into oblivion. The Titanic's casualties included dogs as well. 9 dogs were aboard the ship, most kept in the kennel. When the ship began to sink, someone freed them, causing chaos as the dogs ran around the deck. Sadly, most didn't survive, including a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, an Airedale Terrier, a Chow Chow, and a champion French Bulldog named Gaiman de Picombe. Heart-wrenching stories emerged of passengers who couldn't bear to leave their pets behind. One such passenger was an Elizabeth Isham, who refused to leave without her Great Dane. Miss Isham didn't survive the disaster, and there are rumors her body was later found with her arms wrapped around her dog. On a slightly less depressing note, 3 dogs did survive the Titanic: Lady, a Pomeranian; Sun Yat-sen, a Pekingese, and another Pomeranian belonging to Martin and Elizabeth Jane Rothschild. If you're someone who values good hygiene, count yourself lucky you weren't aboard the Titanic, not just because it sank, but because it must have smelled awful. First-class passengers were better off, with their own private bathrooms, but in third class, things were rough. Imagine 700 people sharing just 2 bathrooms with only 2 tubs. One tub was reserved for 200 women, while over 450 men had to share the other. Even if you had the luxury of a private tub, you wouldn't be using it daily. First-class passengers would go a whole week between baths, as was the norm back then. So, they spent the entire journey stewing in their own sweat and filth. It was a dark and smelly journey indeed. The Titanic will continue breaking our hearts every time we hear more about it. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one.